January 1st. Julia thought she'd awoken to shots. It was raining. Perhaps it had been thunder. A loud clap piercing her out of her dreams. She hobbled to the kitchen. The coffee brewed. She peeked through the dining room window. Earlier there had been shots across the street. An attempted robbery? That time it had been night. Now it was very early. 5. Or was it 6? This was her habit. She'd not been able to stay in bed past 6 for years. There was coffee in the Chronicle, legs crossed on the living room couch, with Audrey the dog at her feet. Hours of waking up, in the silence. She heard only a distant rushing sound from the Beltway, like the roar of spectators from a faraway stadium, and then only if she listened. Sometimes there were sirens. She moved to the front window. The rain was light. A drizzle, rather, or fine mist, but it was the first after 8 months of drought. She gazed out. The front yard looked like shit. I mean, really just complete and total fucking shit. Brown and straggly, huge bald patches scattered about the expanse that sloped to the street. She'd bought this house for its land, a triangle on the corner of a cul-de-sac. The house was dwarfed, drowning in all that lawn engulfing it. When it came to houses, you could always expand. Houses could grow up, but land? She returned to the bedroom, out to the greenhouse. This was where her days really began. Every morning she checked each plant. They were her children. For Julia, the orchid business had coincided with the oil business in the early 80s. She couldn't remember exactly how it had started. A collection of plants, a renovated tool shed, a screened addition to the back of the house, and now this, a freestanding greenhouse in the middle of the backyard, a prism of thin steel beams and clear plastic so high it arched taller than the house. When she'd started building the greenhouse, she'd arrived home to find a notice on its just-hung door. She was being sued. Keith Gaylord, the good doctor, didn't like seeing the greenhouse over the fence. Tense talks with his barking lawyers had determined Gaylord's appeasement. A taller fence, sparing Gaylord Julia's visual affront. The compromise was a work in progress. Julia stepped out. Gloria would be coming today, as she had every week for years. Gloria did the yard. That was something Julia could have handled herself, some raking and mowing, and Julia planted the vegetable and flower beds anyway, but she liked and respected Gloria. The two women were about the same age, and the Southern Mexicana had an expert's appreciation for Julia's plants. Gloria's son Juan might come instead. That sometimes happened. That kid. He was unusual. It started with his appearance. His slightness made him appear taller than he really was. His skin was light, contrasted against the black in which he always cloaked himself, but it was his eyes, large, round, and glassy, with a smokiness around them, that were the most jarring. Julia was never sure what color Juan's eyes were. Every time she'd walk away unable to remember if his eyes were black, brown, hazel, gray, violet, blue, or green. His mouth, full red lips, cut a wide gash across the lower half of his face, as if someone had slashed him with a knife. It wasn't just the way he looked. He walked around with this energy, tenuous, as if not fully present, committed, engaged. That hesitancy, a dreamlike distance, lent him an unfortunate air of suspiciousness and unreliability. It made others want to watch him, yank him tightly with a tether, like a balloon at risk of flying away. He was diffident, but not unfriendly, lazy, unintelligent, or in any way not serious. Julia was wise and compassionate. She knew how to coexist peaceably with the other without understanding him. She could imagine how someone like that had been bullied, especially in a place like Houston. An elegant and refined young man with a beautiful and intelligent face. He was different. He had his own understanding. Rather than control or dominate, she treated him with respect and kindness and left him alone in peace. As expected, he worked best in solitude. He was competent and capable. He did everything that was asked of him, and then some. He worked efficiently, thoroughly, so fast Julia could not believe it. She'd step inside for some small task and emerge to find everything so meticulous it was as if a sort of cleaning hurricane had swept through. Juan's mother arrived. A native of Veracruz, Gloria had been a Pasadena resident for 30 years. Still, she was not a citizen. She'd just never gotten around to it. Here she'd buried both a husband and a son. She'd wanted to be an artist of some kind before her husband had taken her and her children to this foreign land. How strange to feel so far away from her youth and happiness in what was technically North Mexico. Juan came, this kid. Gloria didn't know what to do with him. He was too sensitive. He seemed soft. His feminine face and energy made people think he was weak, but he surprised them with his strength, which had gotten him into trouble a couple of times. He was her only Tejano, and Gloria bemusedly entertained the notion that maybe that was part of the problem. The other two had been born in Mexico. The middle one, Aurelio, had returned from Iraq in a body bag, dead in service to a country that had never been his. Now her oldest, Nestor, was sick with the same cancer that had taken their father. Both older boys had had a meanness about them, a sharp judgment in the brow. That was their father's legacy and their Aztec heritage. They'd become men who drove unnecessarily big trucks to intimidate people with their engines. They'd both bullied Juan, but especially Nestor, who hated his brother with a murderous, psychopathic rage. This went beyond normal sibling rivalry. Nestor had, quite simply, never forgiven his brother for being born. 30 years would pass. Nestor would never get over it. Instead, he engaged in obsessive fault-finding missions, staring, scrutinizing, pouncing on every shred of evidence, no matter how petty, to justify his pre-existing irrational hatred. But nothing could camouflage the obvious reality that Nestor was simply jealous. A lot of it had to do with Juan's face. Every time he saw it, Nestor couldn't shake his delusion that Juan had somehow had an easier life, perhaps because Juan had been born in the States. Nestor would have killed Juan physically if he'd thought he could get away with it. Instead, he tried to murder his brother's soul. He needed Juan spiritually defeated, subordinate, dominated, vanquished. Gloria recognized she'd mismanaged the situation. Still, it helped Nestor to have a scapegoat. As long as Juan was alive to blame for all the evils of the world, Nestor never had to take responsibility for his own bullshit. 9/11, that was Juan's fault. World War II, Juan. When Nestor ran out of toothpaste, well, by now you know the routine. Gloria had to admire her baby's strength. Abused by both his father and his brothers, Juan was still good. Unbreakable spirit. It was time to take Audrey for a walk. Julia had to watch the gate. When she wasn't careful, the dog would slip out and prance about the circle, glancing back coyly. Always within view, she'd eventually amble back on her own. Julia led Audrey down the driveway. Gaylord's lawn was not just green, but ridiculously so. Brilliant, glowing, almost neon. His workers had mowed neat, visible strips into it, as an obsessive-compulsive vacuums a carpet. Workers came to his house practically every day. Their trucks overflowing with equipment took up almost the entire circle. It was then that Julia spotted Sorrow. Sorrow was the name she'd given the owl that had recently been frequenting her property. She'd also spied it in Terry Hershey Park, sashaying insouciantly across the paved trail. Several mornings it had come to the bayou to her house as if intentionally targeting it. Perched outside Julia's front windows, Sorrow would sit in a sort of standoff with Audrey, rousing the latter to a thrombotic fit. This morning, for some reason, Sorrow had taken position directly in front of Gaylord's door. Gaylord arrived in his CL from a morning city council meeting. There was a motion before the council to deny health care, even emergency treatment, to undocumented residents without insurance. Gaylord was lobbying hard as one of the measure's strongest proponents. Gaylord was also busy with some construction of his own. He'd bought a house across the creek behind this one and was building a bridge connecting the two. The whole project was hideously tacky. reeking of nouveau riche, like the other monstrosities spreading like a virus in this classic neighborhood. Ghastly Greco-Roman marble creations decked out with columns and fountains and cupids, and twin lions or sphinxes or griffins. They had postage-stamp lawns so close to the street Julia feared they might tumble into it. These were the kind of people who tiled their floors with malachite. It was what Tom Wolfe termed hog-stompin' Baroque, or, as Julia's father had put it, cherub incrustation. With Gaylord was Clarity, Miss Flavor of the Month. Over the past 6 months there had been a steady stream of these, young women suspiciously thin with the bodies of 8-year-old boys. Gaylord was a pedophile. He was also an exhibitionist. He parked the CL across the street from his empty driveway and made Clarity walk, parading her to prove he wasn't gay. Much of this relationship was unfolding in and around Gaylord's pool, in full earshot of Julia's backyard, thanks to the open fence. As Julia worked with her plants, she learned about Gaylord's car, his guns, his watches, his electronics, and even his gold. He was trying to impress Clarity and anyone who listened. Julia couldn't imagine how the attention of a retired single oil executive could be of any interest to Gaylord, unless of course he lived in the eyes of other people, so desperate for attention that anyone would do. He was that tree falling in the forest. He had no identity without an audience. His abuse of Clarity was the usual cocktail. An unrelenting onslaught of lies and mind games, mixed with cruelty, insults, put-downs, ridicule, and mockery, and topped off with stifling, smothering, suffocating control. Gaylord was one of those men who knew he couldn't lift a hand to a woman without getting into trouble. So, instead, it was death by 1,000 cuts. He tried to break her spirit. He was trying to put out her light, and he was enjoying it. Julia sighed and shook her head. That poor girl. She'd actually liked this one. Clarity was different. She had her own understanding. Now she looked like she wanted to die. In just 2 months the damage Gaylord had done was visible. Miserable in the too tight jeans he'd forced her into, Clarity trudged along, head down, shoulders hunched, physically beaten down under the weight of psychological abuse. From behind dark circles she made eye contact with only Juan. He knew. They knew. Julia set out on her route, a well-worn pattern up and down each cul-de-sac. She'd like to walk down the road with no name that ran along the back of the neighborhood, but Audrey refused to go. Every time they reached the road's gated entrance, the dog went apeshit, snarling, growling, tugging at the leash, digging in her heels, and whining so piteously it was heartbreaking. Julia saw no threats in that straight, simple stretch of black tar, but there was something there the dog clearly didn't like. When Julia returned, Gloria and Juan were surveying the fence. The rain had halted construction. The gaps of wet splintered wood were largest toward the back, exposing the courtyard and pool, reflected in floor-to-ceiling panes lining the front of the house. Juan stared into Gaylord's house. Juan's calm, aloof exterior belied a frisson of anxiety, an electrical current under the surface. He had the serenity of a deer, frozen, paralyzed, in anticipation of its predator. He wasn't arrogant, stuck up, or a snob. His problem was fear. The night before, Nestor had gone into the hospital. The cancer was spreading fast. The treatment would be expensive. Without insurance, the family had no idea how they were going to pay for it. Juan didn't care about Nestor. He didn't want to see his mother broken. He'd been there when the serviceman had arrived at the house and handed her the piece of paper, doubled over, wailing with anguish. She couldn't lose another son. That night, Julia didn't sleep well. At her age, that happened. She sighed. It was useless. She would go for a night walk. Without Audrey, she could go down the road with no name. About halfway down, her neighbors had placed a couple of benches overlooking the bayou. Julia sat. Light was beginning to spread across the sky. She'd wanted to be an artist of some kind, but she'd loved the oil business. It had taken her all over the world. In her 50s, she'd been let go too soon. and her light had gone out. That was what had really broken her, not this damn lawsuit. Her eyes were clear, wide, and watery, beaten out by grief. It began to rain again. Julia turned. As she did, Audrey burst through the brush. Now how had she gotten out? Had Julia accidentally left the gate open? Julia was seriously worried. Not only had Audrey escaped, but also she'd braved the road with no name to come get her. Julia saw the light from the sirens first. As she rounded the corner, the emergency vehicles came into full view, crowded into the spot normally occupied by the lawn workers' trucks. There had been a break-in. Gaylord's front door, wide open, revealed shattered glass across the patio and into the pool. Someone had opened the gate and slipped through a hole in the fence. There had been a scuffle. The intruder had been unarmed. Julia had not heard the shots. Gaylord had fired with one hand on the phone to the police, shooting not the intruder, but Clarity. In the darkness, she'd gotten in the way. As Gaylord had lowered his gun, he wasn't sure what he felt. Mostly, he felt nothing. Juan emerged in handcuffs, followed by Gaylord, who offered the officers a firm handshake and a flash of his veneers. Inside, blood was spreading out from under Clarity's fallen body. In the rain, Julia stood, Audrey at her side. They glanced up. Sorrow cried as she flew away home.